The acolyte's hand was pushed toward the plaster face with a wooden spatula while the high priest read the indictment aloud. The occult researcher felt suspicion tighten behind his ribs and did not move from the shadow of the vestibule column. The high priest, you named a form, you gave the god a face, and the crowd answered with a low chorus of agreement. The plaster scraped. White dust settled on the acolyte's wrist. That immediate demand, destroy the face or be judged, made the conflict clear and pulled the researcher into the room like a hooked fish. He was 48. He kept his salt and pepper hair combed back, his scholar's coat buttoned over an archaic robe, and a brass monocle tucked in the inside pocket of the coat. He watched the acolyte's fingers tremble as plaster flakes hit the cobbles, and he noticed the thin scar above his own right eyebrow caught at the corner of his vision. Suspicion moved his hands first. He stepped from shadow when the crowd's chant rose and the high priest's voice hardened. The researcher nothing at the vestibule door, but he recorded the chant and the spatula's scrape in detail in his head and narrowed his next actions around those sounds. Stop. A voice called beside him. The researcher turned. A woman held the town ledger under her arm and kept her head low. Scribe, the researcher, I know that man, she answered. He felt curiosity shift into a quiet urgency. The public spectacle was not ritual alone but enforcement. The opening event made the stakes visible. A community punished a young man for imagining a god's face, and that punishment was enforced by ritual law. The researcher had come to the city to trace a rumor that some temples forbade imagining the deity at all costs. Now he saw the law enacted. He wanted evidence, not rumor, and he understood that the first witness, the chalked plaster and the acolyte's limp arm, might be the only physical trail left. He would need testimony texts and a translation that bridged ritual language with cognitive claims. The high priest walked down from the dais and passed within a single step of the vestibule column. He smelled of oil and resin. His robe had stitched sigils at the hem. The god must not be made visible, he said, and the crowd repeated the phrase. A guard nudged the acolyte forward. The acolyte's fingers fumbled the spatula and dropped it. It clattered on the stones. The researcher catalogued the sound and the guard's hand on the acolyte's wrist. After the spectacle, the researcher approached the ledger, holder in the shadow of an alley. I am studying cultic injunctions. I need access to your scriptorium. The woman, town scribe, looked at him and then down the lane toward the temple steps. This belongs to the temple, she said. They will not open the chest unless forced. He glanced at the temple doors where banners still swung from the day wind. He did not argue. He offered a small worn coin and the monocle half hidden in his palm. The scribe led him beneath the sanctuary through a door that smelled of clay and damp. They found a narrow chamber with a chest sealed by wax and a clay tablet wrapped in linen. The scribe's hands hesitated on the seal. No one will know if you only read. The researcher nodded and listened to the wax crack as the scribe pried it free with both thumbs. The tablet slid into view, brittle clay lines of cuneiform pressed faint by age. The researcher fingered the edge of the tablet and felt its texture under his glove. They brought the tablet to the scriptorium where a single oil lamp sputtered above a low desk. The scribe, named Maru, set the tablet on the desk and lit a second lamp. Mara spoke in short sentences while he arranged reed styluses and a small bowl of water for softening the clay. We have laws, Maru, we have injunctions. But this one uses odd phrases. The researcher leaned close. He used his monocle and read a phrase aloud. Do not name a form for that which binds breath. Maru's lips tightened. The phrase suggested purpose beyond piety. The carved words presented form as a binding force. They translated by lamplight for hours. The researcher read the lines and Maru tapped unfamiliar glyphs with a reed. This is not only sacrament, Maru, this is a doctrine about seeing. The researcher paused at the clause. Where shape is fixed, power is taken. Where shape is named, the mouth closes on prophecy. It reads like a cognitive warning. The text treats imagination as a trap. His voice lowered. He held the monocle at a slant and watched Maru's hands tremble above the tablet. Tension rose when guards burst into the scriptorium. 2 leather gauntlets struck the table. The lamp shuddered. The guard captain demanded the tablet returned immediately. You cannot keep temple property, he barked. The researcher moved a reed between his fingers and met the captain's gaze. Maru, the captain said, you will pack this up and bring it to the inner sanctuary. Maru answered with uneven breath. The chest is sealed for a reason. The researcher felt pressure from the captain's stare and a sudden need to protect the tablet for the sake of knowledge. A brief argument flared. The researcher, I only wish to translate for scholarship, the guard captain replied. Scholarship that undermines the high priest is dangerous. The high priest arrived and folded his hands. Return the tablet, he said. The community must not be taught to picture that which binds. The researcher kept his voice low. I saw the acolyte punished, he said. I will not allow a public lie to stand without scrutiny. The high priest's jaw tightened. He called for the guards to escort the researcher out. Outside in the courtyard where oil lamps still glowed, the young acolyte slipped close to the researcher as lantern smoke blurred the columns. He pressed something into the researcher's palm, a charred scrap of cloth with a smear of ink. The acolyte's voice dropped to a whisper that trembled with urgency. My name is Ishar, he said. We were told to erase the face after the prophet described it. They burned the prophet's notes. The researcher glanced at the scrap. The ink formed part of a line, a single word and a scraped sigil. Suspicion widened into a directed aim. The prohibition could be a political instrument. Ishar's hands shook while he spoke. The god looked like a man with a crown of salt. Ishar, after that he was quieted. The imagining would bind the god to human will. It would let rivals name the god and control favor. The researcher put the scrap under the lamp and watched the ink darken in the heat. He who benefits when prophecy is silenced. Ishar did not answer directly. He pressed a fingertip to the smear and left a faint print. Maru knelt and looked at the print. This pattern matches other secret copies. Maru. They planned a controlled experiment in the sealed chamber beneath the altar at midnight. Maru agreed to attempt a sketch using the tablet's verbal cues while Aisha watched in fear and hope. They wrapped their hands with thin gloves and closed the chamber door. The researcher unrolled a strip of prepared parchment and set charcoal on the desk. Do exactly what the words instruct, he said. Do not improvise. Maru took a read and read aloud the tablet's phrases while Isha leaned forward. They followed the verbal cues step by step. Maru drew a curved line. The researcher steadied the lamp. Isha kept his eyes on the paper, and when Maru described the crown of salt, he repeated the words slowly. The charcoal scratched the page. The line formed a face fragment. Then the ink blurred. The line smeared inward though no hand had brushed it. The lamp guttered and the stone cold moved up through the soles of their feet. Ishar gasped and put a hand to his mouth. The chamber slight stuttered. The air did not change temperature, but the sound of their breathing thickened. Maru's reed fell from his fingers. The charcoal on the page shifted as if drawn by an unseen palm, and the sketch lost its deliberate shape. The researcher felt a pressure behind his eyes and reached instinctively for the monocle. He stopped. Maru looked at him and then at the paper. It is resisting. Maru, something struck Eshar's head. He collapsed without sound. Maru fell backward into a cedar chest and clutched his side. The researcher dropped to his knees, braced his hands on the desk, and peered at the parchment. The smear on the page crawled like spilled oil and darkened with an inner motion that made Maru's hair stand at his temples. The researcher felt an instinctive revulsion. The act of fixing a form had produced a reactive force nobody could ignore. His suspicion hardened into fear. He gathered Ishar and carried him to the courtyard with Maru supporting the acolyte's head. Ishar's eyes fluttered open and closed. He could not speak. Maru's hands shook so hard that the lamp's flame jumped. In the pale dawn, the researcher debated with Maru whether they should publish the tablet's translation or hide it. Maru, if the temple learns we proved this, they will call us profaners. The researcher touched Aishar's forehead and felt the damp of fever or shock. He thought of the prophet whose notes had been burned and of the acolyte forced to erase a face in the square. They agreed to copy selected lines into a private memorandum and to conceal the original tablet beneath the scholar's study. Maru burned a small flake of the tablet's edge to test whether the script retained its potency when broken. The flake turned to ash and left a faint residue in the marks on Maru's glove. The researcher recorded the residue with a tiny brush and sealed it in wax. He wrote a warning in the margin of his copy and underlined the phrase about form binding breath. That night, a pair of guards walked the street outside the researcher's study and paused beneath the window. The researcher watched them through a slit in the shutter and wrapped the tablet in linen. He folded the linen twice, slid it inside a hollowed book, and placed the book atop his shelf. Maru watched from the doorway and kept his head low. The researcher handed Maru a coin and the brass monocle. Keep the monocle, Maru, you will need it again. The researcher placed the monocle on his finger and felt the weight of choice. The chapter closed with an immediate concrete beat. The researcher set the copied margin in his desk and then heard a cautious knock at the outer gate. He walked to the window and saw the guard captain look up at the rafters before he met the researcher's eye. The researcher opened the shutter a sliver, met the captain's steady stare, and laid a single hand on the hidden book beneath the shelf. He did not speak. The captain tilted his head once and walked away. The researcher closed the shutter and sat at the desk. He wrote a single line in the margin. "Beware the law that binds sight to will." Then he blew out the lamp and listened to the guard's footsteps recede down the street. Emotion shifts. Suspicion opening, curiosity translation, fear experiment, resolve concealment guided his choices at each moment. The researcher's actions, entering the vestibule, persuading Maru, conducting the experiment, hiding the tablet, moved the narrative through escalating stakes and concrete decisions. Every external event altered the path. The public punishment, the sealed chest, the guard's intrusion, Ishar's confession, the experiment's recoil, and the guards outside the study. The mini cliffhanger in the middle arrived when the lamp stuttered during the sketch and Ishar fell. The researcher did not yet know whether the force they provoked could be contained. That moment changed his calculation and forced Maru to reconsider whether preserving knowledge was worth the risk. He recorded the outward details, the scrap of ink, the smear left by Ishar's fingertip, the way Maru's hands trembled when he spoke the tablet aloud. These were concrete pieces he could show a later jury of scholars. The chapter resolves its immediate conflict. The researcher secures an authenticated copy, hides the original, and gains a silent ally in Maru and a frightened witness in Ishar. But the final image is specific and situational, not reflective. Guards watch across the street while the researcher places the tablet within a hollow book on his shelf. He cannot publish yet because exposure could lead to arrests, reprisals, or more violent enforcement by the temple. He understands that concealment itself is a choice with moral weight. In the final lines, the researcher rehearses the decision he must now carry forward. He writes the margin warning and records the experiment's effects in precise terms. The smear moved without wind. The acolyte lost consciousness when the line fixed. The scribe's reed fell from numb fingers. Maru leaves the study with the monocle and the coin. Ishar sleeps beneath a cloak in a neighboring house. The guards continue their rounds. The researcher closes his ledger, hides the original, and waits for the next breach of temple authority to reveal whether the law against imagining is theology or instrument. The chapter ends on a concrete audible beat, a second knock, harder this time, at the study's outer door. The researcher set the margin copy inside his breast and walked to the door. He rested his hand on the latch, inhaled the smell of myrrh that lingered in his coat, and turned the handle. He opened it to the dim corridor and met a face he had not expected to see. The guard slammed the scriptorium door as he wrenched the clay tablet from Mena's hands, exposing the act that could cost the scribe his life. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's throat. He moved without announcing himself, fingers already reaching for the record he hoped to inscribe. The guard spat a word of accusation and held the tablet up for the lamplight. A shallow sketch, soft scratches on fired clay, the beginning of an outline that the priests had forbidden. The central problem was immediate and visible. Someone had tried to make a visible outline of a deity, and that attempt now threatened the scribe, the sanctuary, and whatever rules bound both ink and law. The occult researcher had watched such moments before. He had seen an acolyte's hand pushed toward a plaster face at the last trial, watched a high priest read an indictment while the accused trembled. He stepped forward now because suspicion had settled on him like a weight. Suspicion that this incident was not accidental, but part of a wider effort. He did not announce his name. He opened his notebook and held the pen above the margin, eyes on Mena's hands. Mena's fingers were smudged with lamp, blackened clay dust. He did not look up. "Give it here," the guard barked. Eshman, the occult researcher, voice low, "Let me note the hand's pattern." The tablet's orientation matters. High Priest Eshman's shadow filled the doorway. He took the tablet with a short, practiced motion and read aloud the single line the guard had carved as indictment. He rendered shape where law forbids. Eshman's voice cut the room, precise as a tally. "Mena, how do you plead?" Mena swallowed. I saw the mark in the margin and tried." His sentence broke under the priest's gaze. He kept his eyes on the clay as if it might still move. The occult researcher recorded the reading, notating Eshman's exact words. He watched Mena's jaw tighten and the way the young scribe pushed the scrap of cloth into his palm to rub away his fingerprints. Suspicion moved into doubt. Had Mena copied from something, or had he invented an image of his own? The difference mattered. The law punished visualization born of secret imitation more harshly than idle copying. Eshman stepped closer. Mena, he said, explain how this came to be before I call the guards. His tone held an old ritual rhythm. It demanded confession. Mena's breath came fast. I traced a line I thought I saw in the margin. I thought it would only be a practice stroke. I did not mean to bind or name. His hands trembled. He used short phrases. The room answered with silence that was full of rules. The occult researcher glanced at the stacks where the archives slept behind iron grates. He thought of the erased folio he had once seen and the reluctant glyph that would not remain described. He thought of the acolyte pushed toward plaster in the earlier trial, and the way Eshman had pronounced the indictment like a ledger entry. He had come to the temple as an observer. Now he was cataloguing potential evidence. They moved to the archive chamber beneath the sanctuary at Eshman's command. The chamber smelled of oil, dust, and the iron tang of stored wax. Mena walked with stiff shoulders between heavy shelves. Eshman walked ahead, the monocle at his temple catching light. The occult researcher kept his notebook visible, a buffer against accusation. You touch forbidden lines before. Mena, Eshman, you know the precedents. Mena's answer was a whisper. I traced it, High Priest. I cannot say why I set the stroke. Eshman's eyes flicked to the researcher. And you, scholar, what would you record? The researcher lifted a page and wrote the phrase Eshman had spoken at the trial. He recorded the exact angle of the tablet, the grain of the clay, the pressure of the stylus. He noted Mena's hesitation in the margins as if the hesitation itself might be a sign. The accusation turned interrogation. The researcher listened for the words that treated visualization not as imagination but as theft. Eshman used a legal pattern. Visualization as binding, form as property. The researcher felt his suspicion shift to cautious curiosity. The line between theft and salvation was a ledger the clergy kept with sharp rules, and he needed to know which column Mena's act fit. That night after the council dispersed, the researcher joined archivist Zara in a secret reading alcove behind a locked stack. Zara moved with precise care, unrolling a folio that smelled of soot and starch. She tapped a finger along an erasure where the top layer had been scraped away. The scraped place held a faint trace, a glyph that refused to sit tidy on the surface. It blurred under close study, the strokes smearing like oil on heated metal. It resists description, Zara, and she did not sound surprised. The scribe who erased this did not stop because he wished to hide it from men. He stopped because the shape fought his hand. The researcher leaned in. He placed his palm near the folio and felt a slight resistance in his fingertips, a prickling like pins, but localized and concrete. His suspicion shifted again, now to a quiet private fear. He felt his throat tighten and his fingers slow. He did not use the word fear aloud. He catalogued the physical reaction. The sticks of his pen trembled as he wrote. Does it change when one stares? He asked. Zara shook her head. It slides away if you name it. It will not be confined to a line. They removed a tiny scrap under Zara's kerchief and wrapped it in beeswax. Zara's hands did not falter. This once surfaced in a marginal note during a trial 10 years back, she said. You remember the acolyte's hand pushed to plaster. Eshman presided then too. He sealed that case and called it aberrant. The researcher thought of that plaster face, how an accused hand had brushed its ear as the priest read the indictment. He recalled the way Eshman had pronounced the punishment gently. The ledger closed and the acolyte removed. The memory served as a concrete reference. A precedent that made Mena's act more dangerous. Word spread in the cloister as it always did. A secret becomes rumor through whispered trade. By midnight a small group had gathered in a ruined storeroom beneath the outer cloister. Brother Kadesh stood beneath a broken beam and spoke without softening his voice. We are bound by dogma that fears sight. Kadesh, they say, shape enslaves. I say shape can free. Layla, an initiate, sat close to the circle's ground and traced the edge of a chipped oil lamp with her thumb. Brother Kadesh. The law is clear. Eshman will burn this if he learns. Kadesh smiled without humor. Eshman fears what he cannot ledger. He fears a shape that refuses to be owned. We will do what Eshman will not. Give the god a contour and see if it answers. Two ritualists nodded and arranged clay and black ink. The researcher watched without stepping forward. He had sworn to observe, but his fingers itched to record the sequence. The way Layla ground pigment between her palms, the exact angle of Kadesh's shoulder as he drew a charcoal guide on soft clay. His curiosity tugged like a second mind. If you make a frame, Zahara whispered to him, then it will show its seams. The danger is in the attempt, not only the product. They began the experiment. Kadesh instructed Layla in measured tones, hold the clay flat, trace one continuous line. Do not name the shape, do not add eyes, do not give limbs. Only a border. Layla's hands moved with careful rhythm. She spoke to clay in short sentences. Steady, steady. One line, her voice kept time. The researcher recorded each movement. He watched the charcoal form an outline and saw the pigment bead along the ridge. As they worked, the clay seemed to alter its reflection under the lamp. The line did not stay put. It shimmered, not like light but like fine ink on water that refused to settle. One ritualist, quicker of hand than the others, leaned forward and said, "It is leaning inward." The line wants depth. He touched the clay and his fingers slid across the outline. The pigment ran in a thin streak toward the center as if repelled by the outline's intent. Layla's breath hitched. The researcher felt fear sharpen into urgency now. He stood and stepped toward the circle. "Stop touching it," he ordered. His voice contained authority. It broke the rhythm. Kadesh's lips curved. "Let it show itself. If we fear the result, then we do not deserve to see." The pigment continued to move. The outline tightened and then loosened, as if the image were testing whether it could hold form. An initiate began to fret. His hand hovered at the rim of the clay. "Brother Kadesh, the ink one, stay Kadesh. Hold the line. Breathe on it." Bind with chant, he began a phrase in an old dialect, and two ritualists picked it up with matching cadence. The sound vibrated the air. The researcher noted how the chant matched the pressure of Layla's thumb. The experiment reached its first small reveal. The outline seemed to resist fixation when touched but to stabilize when sound and breath synchronized. The storeroom door splintered inward. Temple guards poured through with torches, the sudden brightness slicing the lamp glow. "By order of High Priest Eshmun," a voice shouted. Hands closed. The researcher shoved toward the threshold and saw a guard strike at Kadesh's shoulder. The ritualists scattered. Layla flinched. The clay shattered as a palm slammed into the table. A scuffle unfolded in 3 quick motions. Kadesh pushed a guard grabbed Layla. The researcher lunged to seize a fragment that spun across the floor. The shard slid across flagstones and came to rest under a stack of crates. The researcher dove, fingers closing on fired clay still warm, and a guard's boot crushed his wrist. He held the fragment anyway. Eshmun arrived with a small party. He moved directly to the smoking center where wet pigment smeared the stone. He looked at the smashed fragment in the researcher's hand and then at Layla's face. "Destroy every trace," he commanded. "And you," he said to Kadesh. "You will answer for this." A loud, rapid exchange followed. "High Priest, this was a controlled test." Kadesh began. "Brother Kadesh." Eshmun, cutting him off. "We will meet mercy where it is deserved. You chose recklessness." Kadesh spat. "You chose cowardice." "Kadesh," Eshmun repeated, voice colder. "You are arrested." The researcher kept the fragment beneath his coat, hidden. He felt doubt press on him. Had he broken his observer's oath? He had not set out to rescue evidence. In the struggle he had chosen action. That choice altered his standing with Eshmun. They moved the detained to the sanctuary vestibule. Hands still stained, Eshmun made a bargain where mercy would be given to those who cooperated and secrecy would be purchased with silence. "You researcher." Eshmun quietly as they stood near the holding cell. "You may keep study. If you catalog and do not spread this." The researcher felt a complex pull of relief, obligation, and guilt. He accepted the bargain in a single motion. He handed over his notes and nodded. "I will not speak of this outside the archive without permission," he said. He did not mention that his coat held a fragment wrapped in linen. Mena sat in a bench nearby, wrists raw from the guard's grip. He avoided the researcher's eyes. When the researcher leaned forward, "Mena, I did not mean to take a god. I only traced a mark. I do not know why I did it." The researcher touched Mena's shoulder, a small nonverbal act. He wrote a single line in his book about the exchange, and then felt his own uncertainty swell into resolve. He would study the fragment, but he would do so alone and quietly. At dawn, the researcher returned to his private study. He placed the wrapped shard on the table next to a brass monocle and his ink-stained gloves. He opened his notebook and began to catalogue every observed motion from the storeroom. The chant cadence, Layla's breath pattern, the way the pigment beaded. He worked with methodical strokes. The physical act of recording steadied his hands. He unwrapped the fragment. Charred edges rimmed the clay. The central scratch retained a thin, glossy smear as if the pigment had melted inward. He held the shard under a lamp and traced the mark with a fingertip, careful not to press too hard. His fingertip registered nothing more than texture. He forced himself to inventory only what he could touch and see. The researcher recorded his tremor in the margin. He noted his own pulse. A quickened pace when the shard was near, a cool steadiness when it was folded away. That was the concrete evidence of reaction he allowed himself, the body moving in relation to the object. He sealed the shard inside the false spine of his oldest grimoire and locked the book's leather strap. He stacked other books on top and lit a thin coil of myrrh at the window. The scent filled the room in a steady, tangible line. He placed his pen down and in that same motion closed the notebook where his day's entries ended with the record: containment enacted, bargain agreed, material secured. Further study under strict measures. He paused with his hand on the strap. Doubt shifted in him one final time into a contained dread that was practical rather than romantic, dread about contagion. If the fragment S property could be imitated, if an outline could reassert itself anywhere a hand tried to hold it, then the taboo could spread through scribes copying for study. He did not write the word contagion in his notes. Instead he wrote the action the word implied: limit access. No replication. When the first knock came at his door there was no herald. He tightened his fingers on the grimoire's strap and answered with measured movements. The knock sound was a concrete beat, 3 short raps followed by a pause. He slid the bolt and opened the door to see Zara's face in the dim hallway. She did not smile. "Zara," he said, "you should not be here." "I came to collect the folio," she replied. "Eshman demands all marginalia be surrendered." "I bring this under protest." She held out a small packet of wrapped papers. He took the packet with one hand while his other hand remained on the strap. "Eshman will claim it for order." "You brought it willingly?" "Yes, as Zahara, and no, I kept a copy." Her admission shifted the stakes again. The researcher found his mouth arranging a question. "Where is it?" Zara hesitated for a fraction, hidden behind the account's ledger. "I cannot study it openly. I fear what I feel when I touch those marks." The researcher watched her face. The physical sign, her hand worrying the packet's edge, showed her fear without naming it. He nodded and closed the door. He catalogued the evening's events in a final entry. The scriptorium seizure, the archive interrogation, the marginal glyph that resisted description, the storeroom experiment that disintegrated into arrest, and the bargain Eshman had offered. He listed names: Mena, Eshman, Zara, Brother Kadedish, Lela. Each name sat next to an action: traced, indicted, concealed, led, initiated. The list read like a ledger of cause and effect. He wrote one more concrete instruction and then paused. If replication occurs, retract to fixed procedures and burn duplicates. He closed the notebook and felt the weight of a choice he had already made. He had intervened in the storeroom struggle. He had accepted Eshman's bargain. He now held a fragment under his coat and a secret in his study. The final act of the chapter was not a philosophical verdict, it was a physical one. He wrapped the charred fragment in oiled cloth, slid it into the false spine of his grimoire, and set the strap across the cover. When a dull knock sounded at his door, he tightened his fingers on the cover as if on a promise. He opened the door and met Zara's steady gaze, and in that exchange both of them registered a mutual decision. The record would continue, but in ways that skirted the law. The personal bargain had trade-offs and the ledger would need more entries. The immediate conflict, the storage, the partial destruction, and the bargain for silence, was closed for now. But the discovery of a glyph that would not be bound changed how each of them would act tomorrow. He burst through the low stone lintel and knocked a candle from the altar. The basin of wet clay shivered under hands that were already shaping a sign. Suspicion tightened the occult researcher's throat as he shouldered forward beneath the rafters of the crypt. Acolytes pressed their shoulders in a ring, breath quick, fingers pressing clay into a shallow bowl. The high priest snapped his head toward the doorway and barked a single name. "Stop!" The word landed like a hand on the researcher's shoulder, and for 1 second everything in the crypt was motion and heat and the wet slap of clay. The conflict was immediate. He did not pause to introduce himself. He moved to the basin and reached without ceremony for the nearest shard. The guard shoved him back with an elbow to the ribs. "You cannot touch that," the guard said. "High priest, he is an intruder." The researcher tasted iron on his tongue and found his hands steady. He had come because a scribe's tablet had been wrenched away days before, because a trial in the vestibule had pushed an acolyte's hand toward a plaster face, because the memory of that public shaming sat like grit under his collarbone. Those earlier events had hardened his suspicion into a decision. If the ritual would be allowed to force a form into being, he would stop it. He was 48, lean and slightly angular, coat collars damp with myrrh smoke. The grimoire at his hip shifted and clinked as he moved. He did not speak the word he feared. He had learned across many readings that names could bind. He moved instead with his fingers, skimming the edge of the basin as if testing the clay's temperature. The high priest stepped forward, robes rustling. Manna, the high priest, addressing the scribe who knelt at the circle. "Where is your oath? Where is the seal you promised?" Mena's hands trembled over a tablet the guard still held. The guard produced the clay with a hard sound and threw it on the altar. The tablet hit the stone and slid, exposing a shallow array of grooves that refused to sit still. Light from a fallen candle slid across the surface and caught in lines that yawned wide enough to be called a pattern. He named it the High Priest to the ring. He tried to make the shape itself. He tried to name the nameless. The words were not accusation only. They were a summons. The acolytes hissed and tightened their circle. The researcher felt the old book press like a weight against his thigh and an old reflex rise. Check marginalia, check back pages, find a counter sign. An earlier shove, the guard's hand at Mena, the scriptorium door slamming, images he had brought from the last days of the trial, tightened his jaw. A single acolyte, younger than the others, glanced at him. The boy's eyes darted to the loose sheet peeking from the researcher's grimoire. The researcher had not meant the folio to fall free. The page flipped open in a breath and a scrap of inked geometry flashed, an unmaking symbol he had sketched between notes. The acolyte's fingers tightened on the bowl. The high priest's eyes narrowed. That sudden discovery shifted the room. The acolyte's hesitation became visible in the line of his shoulders. "Stand back," the high priest ordered. He spoke as though reciting law. "This act will not fail. Hold Mena's eyes open. Force focus. We will attend the name and bind it." The acolyte moved with ritual obedience. Two hands took Mena's cheeks. "Mena, look," the acolyte said. Mena's lips pulled, no sound, only an attempt to obey. The researcher slammed his palm onto the altar. "Stop." The name of the high priest aloud in one clipped phrase. "High priest." The cry fractured the circle. The guard reacted by pinning him against the nearest pillar. "You are outside the right," the guard said. "You are the one who breaks it." He pushed so hard that the researcher felt the old signet ring bite flesh. The researcher did not speak. He reached instead for the folio again, fingers moving to tease the counter, symbol free. Doubt shifted to urgency. The acolyte who had glanced at the page now hesitated entirely, breathing through his nose, pupils wide. The high priest raised his hands to the assembled, palms open like scales, and began a recitation that was low and exact. The words were old and precise. They were designed to fix attention. Candles along the circle flared. The basin's rim began to vibrate under small pressures, fingers sketching into clay and acolyte's nails scoring lines. The researcher saw thread-like patterns emerge that could be named if the room insisted on naming them. He moved his shoulder, twisted. The guard tightened his grip. An acolyte spat a short command at the researcher. "Back away, scholar." The researcher's voice did not rise. "Acolyte, listen to me," he said. His finger traced a set of strokes in the air, simple and deliberate. "Do you remember the trial?" he asked the acolyte, the plaster face. The boy's jaw worked. "Yes," the acolyte said, voice small. They pushed the hand. "I saw it." That concrete image, an acolyte's hand shoved toward a face, had been part of the earlier public trial. Now it returned as proof that ritual law could escalate into violence. The researcher's suspicion bent toward protection. The high priest ignored the exchange and continued the recitation. The basin's surface pulled into a shallow relief that wanted to be a thing. Mena's shoulders jerked. His eyes, forced widely open, reflected a pattern that looked almost like a mouth. The high priest murmured the binding phrase and pointed. "Name it," he said to the room. "Let it be called." Acolyte hands pressed the clay inward, coaxing an edge to hold. The researcher made a decision with an action. He lunged forward, twisting free of the guard's hold, and knocked the basin sideways. Clay slopped across the cold floor. The guard grunted and threw himself into the researcher. The two men crashed into a stone bench. The acolyte who had hesitated reached for the fallen shard of clay and, without speaking, slid it into his sleeve. That small theft was a rupture, an action that changed the tenor of loyalty in the ring. Quick dialogue snapped through the chamber. "God, hold him!" The high priest demanded. "High priest, stop calling it." The researcher said, "Stop talking it into being. You are the blasphemer." The high priest returned. "You deny law." The guard cursed and shoved the researcher to the floor. The researcher's fingers dug into flagstones. He felt the scrape along his palm and, in the motion, found a folded page tucked in his sleeve, the margin where he de-sketched the counter symbol. He thumbed it open and smoothed the ink with a knuckle. The acolyte at the side chamber paled. An external event came like a struck flint. A loose folio from the researcher's grimoire fluttered farther than he expected and slapped the high priest's foot. The high priest's eyes tracked the movement and the room answered. A rustle, a high note in the chanting that broke into a cough. The acolyte who had taken the clay from the floor stood up and said his name. "I am Kedar," he declared. He walked toward the researcher and placed the shard on the altar in front of the high priest. "Kedar, the high priest, why have you betrayed the circle?" Kedar's hands trembled. "I will not help you force a shape," he said. This tentative defection altered the balance. The guard moved toward Kedar. "You will regret this," the guard said. Kedar did not flinch. He produced from his sleeve a short iron rod, a ritual implement, and offered it to the researcher with a bare, steady hand. Without speaking, the researcher took it. The iron felt cool and honest in his palm. Another external event. The high priest set his jaw and recited a louder, keener phrase. Candles bucked. The circle's air thickened with dust and smoke from the altar. Fear cleaved into action. The high priest forced the recitation, voice rising. He bent toward Mena and intoned a consonant cluster that pushed against the room. Mena convulsed, his body arched and then stilled with a single ragged breath. The basin, which had been broken, still held a small wet mound, and threads of clay began to knit where they should not have. The high priest reached for that formed patch with ritual hunger. "Give it name," he said. "Name it now." The researcher's hands were on the iron rod. He moved his palm to the counter symbol. His thumb traced ink lines until the symbol was warm with the heat of his skin. A physical struggle erupted. The guard lunged and hit the researcher in the ribs. The researcher rose, and used the iron rod to pry the tablet free from Mena's hands. Mena screamed once, a sound with teeth in it. The acolyte holding Mena's eyes tried to clamp his fingers on the lids and failed. The researcher shouted, "Kedar, hold the line!" Kedar stepped between the guard and the researcher, planting his feet. "Kedar, stand down." The high priest cried, "No, Kedar, I will not help you make it known." The three men moved in tight, rapid exchange, shoves, grabs, a thrown elbow. Dialogue snapped short, each line a hit, then the real shift. The researcher managed to slide the grimoire page beneath the basin's wet edge and, with a single precise motion, traced the counter symbol into the clay. The symbol did not look like a negation, it looked like a hinge. The high priest's recitation accelerated, candles flared higher. For a heartbeat, the nascent shape threshed as though it resisted the counter mark. A sharp crack echoed when the basin's rim split. Clay flew. Participants lurched backward as a gust of cold moved through the circle. That gust was not a metaphor. The gust knocked two candles from their holders, splashing hot wax, and singed the sleeve of the high priest's robe. He reeled, sight blurred by smoke. The researcher was knocked to one knee. He coughed and tasted ash. The shape, whatever tendon of form, had been coalescing, thrummed, and then retracted like a mouth withdrawing. Mena lay on the floor, breathing raggedly. The guard was on his back, dazed, and the high priest's forehead had a cut where stone had grazed his brow. An external event followed. A sudden, sharp sound from the side chamber, the scriptorium's outer door banging as someone outside tested it and failed. The high priest swore and staggered upright, hand seeking the bowl for a final recitation. The acolytes looked at one another. The researcher pulled himself to his feet and, with a hands-on motion, collected the larger fragments of clay. He did not speak a triumph. His body showed strain. Elbows, white fingers trembling, the high priest bellowed, "Seize him!" But the guard's glare had shifted. He was assessing wounds rather than doctrine. He had seen clay lash and had been struck by its recoil. The guard stepped between the high priest and the researcher, an unreadable look in his eyes. Silence followed that fracas, heavy with breath and wringing blood. The researcher checked Mena's pupils. They responded but slowly, tracking light in a jerky way. Mena's speech was a string of broken phrases. "I saw there was a hole, no hold, like a mouth, but wrong." He stopped, chest-heaving Mena, the researcher said, kneeling. He touched Mena's wrist and felt a pulse that thudded irregularly. "You lived through it," the researcher said. "We will record what happened." Mena blinked and, in clumsy order, nodded. That nod was a quiet decision and a containment of panic. The high priest did not accept defeat. He lurched toward the altar, dragging a candle with him, and began to gather shards as though to reseal the bowl. "You will not unmake what has been named," he said. "The law stands. The people must be kept from shapes that contain them." Kedar stepped forward and said, "High priest, the people live under your law now, but you meant to bind us to fear. You mean to control what minds cannot hold." That accusation landed. The high priest's face darkened. He lifted a hand in reprimand and then stopped. The man was wounded and pragmatic now. He scanned the room and counted allegiance with eyes. He had numbers against him. Several acolytes looked at Kedar as if for instruction. A short confrontation followed, 3 to 5 rapid lines of dialogue. "Kedar," the guard said, voice hoarse, "what did you do?" "I did what I could," Kedar replied. "I took a shard. I offered the rod." "You betray the right, the high priest. You betray the gods, high priest," the researcher said, breathing. "You forced a man to hold his eyes open. You risked a life to seek a form. We sought to protect the community." The high priest answered, "By determining the true shape first, we bind its influence." "You sought control, Kedar. You sought to own the imagining, the back." And fourth paused like a blade held over a throat. The researcher had a flash of clarity. Prohibition had been used as a tool to monopolize cognition. He remembered the guard slamming the scriptorium door and ripping the tablet from Mena's hands. He remembered the acolyte's hand shoved toward plaster during the trial. Those earlier concrete actions stitched together into a single picture of institutional control. He spoke plainly. "High priest," he said, "you used the fear of seeing to keep people from thinking for themselves." The high priest's mouth tightened. He looked like a man deciding whether he would punish for truth or for ritual. Another external event shifted the room again. A faint tapping at the outer corridor, a messenger perhaps, then silence. The high priest looked at the sound and then at Mena. He made a choice that altered the outcome. He did not call for the researcher to be executed. He did not call for a public trial. Instead, he turned away from the altar and gestured to the guard. "Bind him," he ordered, voice low. "Bind him until dawn. We decide then." The guard looked at the researcher, then down at the pool of clay. He hesitated and then moved to comply. Kedar stepped in and jammed his body between the guard and the researcher. The researcher felt the moment as small and decisive. He could have fled, could have let the law take its course, but he had come here to preserve evidence, not to run. He allowed his wrists to be bound with rough cord, but he did so while pocketing a small shard. The shard that he had pried free during the clash and that had a faint smear of the counter symbol on its underside. He hid the shard in the inner fold of his coat where his signet rested. The binding was a choice to stay. The pocketed fragment was a choice to remember. Night thinned toward dawn. The high priest ordered the chamber cleared. Acolytes checked candles. Someone tossed fresh oil on a brazier. The researcher slept with eyes open in fits, jaw tight, because to sleep cleanly would have meant surrender. He listened instead to the low murmurs and to the cough of the guard. He checked the grimoire's margins and copied one short line into his own hand. A warning of where attention becomes a trap. The action was small, copying a phrase, folding a corner of a page. But it was a decision. Keep a record, leave a trace, do not let the law erase what had been done. At first light he climbed the narrow stair to his study above the temple. The city still breathed slower now. He closed the door and set the larger fragments on the table. He looked at Mena's tablet one more time and then took a torch to the pile. He did not read the words aloud. He did not recite. He fed the clay to flame until only blackened edges remained and the scent of scorched earth rose. He kept one shard that fit in his palm like a sliver of bone. He wrapped it in oilcloth and tucked it into his pocket next to the marginal note he had copied. The final scene in the scholar's study was careful and concrete. He sat at his desk, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands ink stained. He wrote a warning line in the grimoire, a single instruction for anyone who might find the book later. He closed the book and placed the brass monocle on top as if to seal the page. Outside the window, dawn sent a narrow bar of light across the floor. The researcher felt the brass cold against his fingers and the shard warm in his pocket. He did not say a philosophical line about consequence. He made one concrete choice. He would preserve a single clue, because the history of this taboo needed study, and because touching the thing that must not be imagined carried its own cost. The chapter resolved a small set of conflicts. The high priestess experiment had been interrupted. Mena survived but returned altered. He could not hold a stable description of the shape he had been forced to see. Kedar had chosen to defect and, by offering a ritual implement and a shard, had shifted the loyalties of the guard. The guard's willingness to restrain rather than execute the researcher indicated a fracture in the temple's chain of command. The researcher had kept evidence and had chosen to limit immediate exposure by burning most of the tablet. His decision to pocket a shard and copy a marginal warning meant the knowledge would not vanish. In that sequence of concrete acts, the forbidden imagining remained dangerous, and the social power that enforced the taboo had been both exposed and weakened. The researcher closed the grimoire, slid the small shard into his inner pocket, and snapped the cover shut as dawn light filled the sliver of the study. He then pushed the heavy bolt across the door and felt the wood settle into place.